I'm not so much interested in the 4th of July as the beginning, more or less, of the War of Independence and the United States becoming an independent country and so on and so forth. I'm more particularly interested in the Declaration of Independence and particular this assertion of universal and equal rights in the Declaration of Independence, and why I think that that is still an important idea to hold on to, and an idea that was revolutionary at the time, was seen as revolutionary and something to keep in mind by many subsequent progressive movements, and something that I think that we should continue to bring up and consider today. And I'm going to go into why I think that's the case. I've always liked this photo. It's a photo I took of a mural or a mural in Memphis, downtown Memphis. I've always liked it. I use it for various things, so on and so forth. Like I said, it was going to be the background. I realized though that I wanted to make it a separate slide because one of the reasons I actually like it is because it speaks to something that I'm trying to get at specifically in this presentation. And so it's a mural of folks, mostly men, mostly black men, who were going on strike in Memphis in 1968. It was the famous sanitation workers strike in Memphis. It was the strike that brought Martin Luther King out to Memphis, where he was eventually killed. These were folks who were fighting over the right to form a union, the right to work for a decent wage, the right to work in safe conditions. And this was, of course, going on in the context of the larger civil rights movement, a larger assertion of humanity and me as a human having certain rights. And I think well summed up in this assertion of I am a man. And I'm going to expand that out, even though, you know, the language is usually gendered, to expand that out to say I am a human or I am a person. And it's an assertion of by virtue of existing, I have certain rights that I get, again, because they're inalienable. They exist by virtue of me being alive. And when those rights are being infringed upon by a government, by the employer, in any aspect of society, I am going to assert those rights, usually in coalition with other people. And I'm going to work to create change in order to realize those rights. And the Declaration of Independence, of course, states those. It talks about folks having inalienable rights. And then it includes this element of if those rights aren't being met, folks have the duty even to shape, change the government, the larger political, social struggles, social structures around them in order to realize those rights. And so what I realized is that in this image of I am a man of these striking Memphis sanitation workers, I was seeing a lot of what I'm trying to capture in the radicality of the Declaration of Independence. And not so much, if I can be a little nuanced, the Declaration itself, but the idea, again, that assertion of universal and equal rights in the document. As I said, the Declaration has been used by many people and groups seeking progressive change. I'm going to detail some of those throughout the presentation. The demand for universal and equal rights in a government that reflects those rights is a revolutionary demand, and I'm going to explain why I think that is more towards the end of the presentation. And I also have this element of adding a working class point of view to the Declaration of Independence. And I get this idea of a working class point of view or a class point of view from an article that Lenin actually wrote in the very early first years of 1900, 1902, I think it was, essentially saying that any struggle that indicates the need for political liberation, that is an issue that is of interest to the working class. So what I'm going to do is move through several different events in history that I feel like trace this long demand for universal and equal rights, and then I'm going to bring it up to the present. The first one I'm going to talk about is the English Revolution, and especially the debate between the levelers in the English Revolution and the parliamentarians. In the debates that were taking place in this context, and in particular a debate called the Putney debates, and this is a etching of that debate, there was one of the first and most widely publicized declarations of universal and equal rights. And I think it's here that we can see something of a beginning of an assertion of universal and equal rights being used for political ends. And so, in particular, this guy, Thomas Rainsborough, who was responding to an argument put forward by the parliamentarians, and I'll approach those in a sec, says that I think that the poorest he that is in England has a life to live as the greatest person. I'm paraphrasing here. And that truly every man that lives under a government ought to, by his own consent, put himself under that government. So the consent to be under a government. And that the poorest person in England is not bound in a strict sense to that government that hasn't had a voice to put himself under. So, in language that might jar our ears a little bit today, essentially making that point. People have equal rights, and that if the government is not respecting those, they have the right, the duty to overthrow that. And this particular debate was taking place around what should Parliament look like. The English Civil War in general was a struggle between more or less a monarchical rule and a republican form of rule in which Parliament essentially made the decisions, and the levelers and the other parliamentarians were debating over essentially how democratic that Parliament should be. And in very interesting ways that I'm only sort of teasing here in this presentation, these ideas flow through history. So we might be familiar with the Quakers, for example. The Quakers were a dissident political movement that were born out of the English Revolution. The Quakers then maintain some of these ideas of democracy, political rebelliousness that remain within England. The parents of the next person who I'm going to get to are impacted by these ideas. Quaker ideas come to what will become the United States. So another thing I hope to at least just tease with this presentation is how ideas are flowing through history, more or less. This idea of universal and equal rights is sort of flowing through history. So that next person is Thomas Paine. If there is one person that I feel like we should consider from the 1776 period, the American Revolutionary period, it is Thomas Paine. We could do an entire presentation just on Paine and his significance. This particular drawing, I don't remember who it was done by, but it's not supposed to be a flattering depiction. It's supposed to depict Paine as sort of a globe-trotting mercenary with a long list of various things that he wants to see realized. I think equality of property might be the third one down there. It's a little hard to read. But, he's got his bag of weapons. And first he was in the States doing his thing. And then he was in England and he got kicked out of England because, he was supporting the French Revolution. And then he was almost killed during the French Revolution. And so he has this sort of, mercenary of democracy figure, if you will. This period of 1776 in the United States opens up a whole plethora of discussions around what sort of political institutions people need in order to realize the ideals put forward in the Declaration of Independence. And Paine engages in one of the more interesting debates with John Adams, especially around unicameralism, bicameralism, so one house, two house, a powerful presidency, a president that's subordinate to the legislative branch. All of these things are being discussed. And they get encapsulated, I think, in the 1776 Constitution of Pennsylvania and the Constitution that we still have today, the one that was created in Philadelphia in 1787. And it's drawing with a little bit of a thick brush, if you will. But I think we can see that some of the earlier state constitutions that came out of this 1776 period and that were being created even at that moment were closer to the values of universal and equal rights. They had institutions, a stronger unicameral legislature, less checks on that democratic power than the Constitution that we would get in 1787. And this is basically going to form the crux of my argument, if you will, at the end around why I think the demand for universal and equal rights is still a revolutionary demand. And Paine is right there. Paine is putting forward these ideas. He's involved in writing the Pennsylvania Constitution. Paine is especially known for his works Common Sense, also the dissertation of the first principles of government. In the dissertation, he puts forward this idea that's reflected in many other spaces. It's a traditional sort of small r Republican idea, in that if you don't have a vote, but also an equal vote, so your vote is no greater or lesser than anyone else's, you're essentially a political slave. You're in a position of servitude because you can't participate on an equal basis in the political process. And this idea I also really want to draw out, because when we're thinking about the Declaration's invocation of universal and equal rights, I think we really want to focus on this idea of political equality. And if we have political institutions that allow for everyone to have an equal say. And so Paine is really getting at that. And the American Revolution, folks have written books and books and books on this, debated it back and forth numerous times, flows into the French Revolution. People have spent a lifetime debating the differences between the revolutions, so on and so forth. But we have the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen put forward in the French Revolution in 1789. And this is a further, I think, assertion of these universal and equal rights, this principle of universal and equal rights as the bedrock of a democracy. And here I quote just a little bit from that. Men are born and remain free and equal in rights. Social distinction can be based only upon public utility. The aim of every political association is the preservation of the natural and imprescriptible rights of man. These rights are liberty, property, security, and resistance to oppression. The property question, again, has also been discussed at length. Is the presence of of property in these demands for equality a mark against them? Does it somehow irreparably tarnish the demand for universal and equal rights? Maybe we can get into that in the discussion session if folks are interested. The assertions put forward in the Declaration of Independence and at various points in the French Revolution have an impact on then the Haitian Revolution. And folks have also written and had debates around just to what extent they did. But I do think that we can put the Haitian Revolution in the story of this expansion of demands for universal and equal rights. Essentially, this idea of, oh, if those people get them, why not us? Here's this idea, that really contradicts our lived experiences. We want those too. We're going to struggle for them, to put it most simply. This is a drawing of Toussaint Louverture, who was a very famous leader of the Haitian Revolution. Haitian Revolution from the early 1790s to 1804, I believe. So it's packed right in there, the French Revolutionary period. Just as I said here, the Haitian Revolution feeds off, perhaps that's a good way of looking at it, feeds off of these ideas and expands upon them, right? It expands upon them by saying these apply to Black people. Not only Black people, but enslaved Black people. For many people, that's an expansion way too far. Part of this, I say this at the end, but part of this is saying these ideas, or this idea of universal and equal rights, is in a way wrested away from the people who originally pronounced them, and is released upon the world and used in ways that would have horrified them had they seen how they'd been used. But it could have essentially been no other way, is another assertion, that once these ideas are out there, there's no way that the bourgeoisie, the slave owners, the capitalists, people who run the US currently, I'd say, can confine them, can say, oh no, well, we mean it here, but not here. Or like, you can have equality here, but not here. It's inevitable that people are going to be saying, why not here? Why not everywhere? So it's taken up within the women's question as well, what I'll call the women's question. There's a picture of Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who was a leading organizer of the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848 in the States. And she actually began this convention with several Quakers. So here again is this interesting continuation of these ideas. The Seneca Falls Convention put forward in their first statement, called the Seneca Falls Declaration, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men and women are created equal. The history of mankind is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations on the part of man towards women, having to direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over her. To improve this, let the facts be submitted to a candid world. To prove this, I should say. So again, the original declaration says all men are created equal. It's inevitable, though it's a very brave thing to do and a very important thing to do, to say, why not women? Why not slaves? And as I'll get into, I keep teasing the sort of constitutional element of the United States, but okay, we're equal in some ways, but not when it comes to the Senate, or not when it comes to the power of the Supreme Court, not when it comes to this idea of universal and equal rights, and specifically the Declaration of Independence by the abolitionist movement. Perhaps folks are familiar with Frederick Douglass's famous speech, what to the slave is the 4th of July. He was actually, funny way how history works, he was actually the only African American attendee at the Seneca Falls Declaration. And he was actually arguing there for women to have the vote. That was not a universal position, given by people who wanted women to have more rights. It was not clear that those rights should include suffrage. The same question comes up after Reconstruction as well. Okay, people aren't slaves, but it's not clear if they should have the vote. And Douglass says, of course, what to the slave is the 4th of July, a day that reveals to him more than on all other days the gross injustices and cruelty to which he's the constant victim. So he's taking the Constitution and he's taking the Declaration, and people do this constantly, taking the Declaration and the values and ideas in it and comparing it to what presently exists, and using that as a way to say, look at this hypocrisy. He's not saying, and people do this at times, he's not saying, look at what our founders wanted, or look at what the framers wanted, or how wise were these men for saying these things, or how great was America for being the country where these ideas were put forward. He's not saying that. He's able to do all of this without getting into the sort of hagiography that, I think we're usually used to. He's just saying, here's this idea. It appears in this document. Look how it contrasts so much with our current condition. And that was powerful. That was rhetorically powerful. That was persuasive. Eugene Debs, a famous socialist from the Socialist Party of America, that was him in 1901. In a 4th of July speech in 1901, he says, I like the 4th of July. It breathes a spirit of revolution. And he has an interesting thing. He says, I'm a patriot, but in the sense that I love all countries. I love the sentiment of William Lloyd Garrison, a very famous abolitionist. All the world is my country and all mankind are my countrymen. Thomas Jefferson, he's sort of floating in here in an interesting way. Where liberty is my country, that's good. Tom Paine, where liberty is honored, that's my country, is better. And then he connects these ideas of liberty, et cetera, to socialism. The connection of the socialist movement to the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, the values or the ideas that we see expressed in the Declaration. Again, people who spent their lifetimes talking about these things. Ho Chi Minh famously used the Declaration of Independence in 1945 when he was presenting the Declaration of Vietnam. It says all men are created equal. He repeats that line. And then I like how he expands on it. He says, this immortal statement was made in the Declaration of Independence. Okay. In a broad sense, this means all the peoples of the earth are equal from birth. All people have a right to live, to be happy, and to be free. So he's doing exactly what I was talking about, as other people are doing. He's saying, here's an idea. Now, here's my interpretation of that. Like, you can't interpret this in any other way other than to say this means everyone, and it has to touch everything. Well, Martin Luther King also many, many, many times brought up the Declaration of Independence, perhaps most famously the 1963 March on Washington. It says the architects of our republic wrote the words of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. His use of both of those is interesting. They were signing a promissory note to which every American was to fall heir. Folks can read the rest of that statement, but I really like in this the idea of a promise. You don't have to think that the folks who wrote the Declaration of Independence were ever going to live up to that promise. Again, people have written books talking about if they were going to live up to it, if they weren't going to live up to it, what did they mean, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But it's been interpreted as something that we should have, and that if we don't have it, it's our right to claim it. And that if the people who promised it to us haven't given it to us, they should be publicly shamed. We should essentially call them out for it. And then it's not much of a stretch to go from there and say, if even after being called out for it, they still don't respond to it, then we go over them. Then we push them aside. Then we do our own thing. It's actually very similar to what Lenin says in that same article, Political Agitation and the Class Point of View. He says, we push he calls them, I think, liberal movements for democracy forward. But at the point that the liberal stops, that they dig in their feet, at the point to which they start saying, universal and equal rights, but not here, or universal and equal rights, but not in this particular area. That's when we, having developed a party of the working class, et cetera, push forward. We keep driving all of that forward. This is a picture of Kathleen Cleaver, who was the communications secretary of the Black Panther Party at a rally to free Huey Newton in West Oakland. The Black Panther Party had their 10 points, their 10-point program. And the 10th point, they just copy paste like the first paragraph of the Declaration of Independence. Here's what I would hope, that when socialist people draw from the Black Panther Party, as people do, especially here in Oakland, people constantly talk about the Black Panther Party. They also recognize that they use the Declaration of Independence. We can interrogate why, and if we think that's still useful, if it's rhetorically persuasive now, if it was rhetorically persuasive then in their context and not in ours. But similar to talking about the Socialist Party of America, if we're going to draw from people, we have to realize what they brought in. And so therefore, it's not good enough to just say, well, because we're socialists, it means burn the American flag. They didn't do that. Now, if they should have, you could make that argument. If we should today, you could make that argument. But we just in some way need to get the history right, if you will, or just be aware that when we're saying something, it's different from how other people who we appeal to treated that thing. To just recognize that and to work through that, essentially. I'll pick it up a little bit here. The last example that I want to use is from the People's Bicentennial Commission, because I was very curious when I started getting interested in this stuff of, well, how has the left interacted with the Declaration of Independence? That's what this presentation is about. The Socialist Party of America at this particular point said this. The Black Panther Party, we could include them in the socialist camp, they said this. Has anything else been done? Has anything else like big and showy been done? And the answer is, of course, yes. I think just not necessarily well documented. One of the things that is well documented is this People's Bicentennial Commission, which was involved in the 200th, protesting the 200th anniversary of the Declaration, so 1976. And they came out of a particular time period associated with the New Left, the anti-Vietnam War movement. It was obvious that the plans that Richard Nixon had initially, this is also right around Watergate, his initial planning committee was overtly corrupt and actually had to be scrapped. And so, this was all in the air. There were concerns about the commercialization of, what should be a non-commercial festivity. They said this, among many things. They said that the bicentennial should not be a time for a grandiose display of chauvinism, but rather a time for the reaffirmation of the principles of democracy and equality for all, which serve as the foundation upon which this nation was built. They're trying to use the Declaration of Independence and this idea of certain principles enunciated at a point in time, 1776, as the foundation upon which we should move forward, as the thing that should sort of push us forward in this moment. But they get it wrong in the sense that the United States was not built on any foundation of universal and equal rights. The idea was asserted there in that moment, but that assertion has not been realized. It never has been realized. It still has to be realized. And so I throw this in to add a little bit of a nuance because my argument is not this. It's not that we need to return to the idea of universal and equal rights in the Declaration of Independence because it was some sort of foundation there and things sort of went off track, or it's been sort of a slow buildup ever since from that point, sort of a greater perfection of the machine, so to speak. It's that we actually need to radically reconstruct society, as King would say, to realize those principles. So that brings us today, and here I'll start winding down a little bit. It's America's 250th. This is, oh, you can barely see it on the screen. This is the official logo of America 250. There are so many of them. It should be obvious to us, I'm sure it is, that the Republicans and the Democrats are really draping themselves in patriotism, nationalism, and the Constitution. They do it in different ways. They do it in ways that sort of play off of each other. You know, they use it to try and one up each other. This person isn't this, but I am. This person hates this, but I don't. You know, vote for me, no vote for me, and you know, back and forth it goes. I want to hone in on the Democrats because they, in particular, are trying to take advantage of our rights, of our inalienable rights, being under attack by the Trump administration, as they are. They're using that opportunity to pose as the protectors of democracy and those rights against Trump. If you give us power, we will protect those rights for you, or we will bring back those rights that have been lost. We'll right the ship, essentially. We'll put America back on the course that it was sort of destined to move along from its founding moment. I want to push back against that, obviously. As I do push back on it, we see the contradictions between the Declaration's pronouncements at that time of universal and equal rights and everything else that was essentially going on. The condition of women, indigenous people, enslaved people, many others when it was written. This is a picture of, I should have written down the artist who did it, but the red faces cover the face of folks in the room when the Declaration was being written who owned slaves. A lot of the people who wrote that all men are created equal owned slaves. Some people at the time called them out for it. A lot of people at the time didn't. We also see the contradictions between this idea of universal and equal rights and everything that the US government has done in the name of the Declaration of Independence since 1776. Still, those contradictions, I'm arguing, are not a reason to let the bourgeoisie claim ownership of the principle of universal and equal human and political rights. And that the idea of those rights, as I said, has actually escaped the confines. It escaped the confines of the colonists and the enslavers a long time ago, as evidenced by all the history I just presented. And we too, I think, should use it as a tool. We too should use it as a tool to turn it against the bourgeoisie's own failure to fulfill those rights. And I'll come to a close by saying how we should use it, I argue, as a tool. And like, what of the many things that we could attack with that tool or try and smash with that tool, what of the many things that we could hold up to the idea of universal and equal rights and say, look how much this contradicts these ideas. Very important thing is the Constitution of 1787. So I argue that we have a constitution that actually ensures minority rule, denies universal and equal rights, and protects the unlimited accumulation of wealth. The property question, which I brought up, people having a right to property. Well, that right to property meant something very different at a time when capitalism was still in its birth phase, if you will. Not everyone who fought for universal and equal rights, but some people, including Tom Paine, Grouchus Babeuf in the French Revolution, a few other folks, saw the right to property as beginning to conflict dramatically with all of these other rights. And they said, this can't be. The point at which the right to accumulate property starts to limit the right to participate equally in politics, to live the good life, essentially, the right to accumulate that property goes away. At that point, the government has the right to intervene. At that point, society has the right to take some of that stuff away, redistribute it. It's not socialism. Perhaps with Babeuf it sort of is. With Paine, it's not. It's not really socialism as we know it, but it's an assertion that some rights override other rights. The other assertion I want to make is that it's the working class that's going to need to lead this struggle for a democratic constitution, a democratic political system, and I think through that, a democratic economy. And I've mentioned Lenin a few times. This is Lenin and the tasks of the Russian Social Democrats, written in the very late 1800s, basically saying in more flowery language that it's the working class that's the only and thoroughly consistent champion of democracy. And I think that's something that's become especially clear in our time, and the development of a working class as a thing, and then the development of a theory in Marxism that says that thing, the working class, is the emancipatory agent. That comes 70 or so years after the American Revolution. That's now a very much a part of our lexicon that it wasn't then. But the same idea applies, right? We're still struggling to get those universal and equal rights. We're still struggling to get democracy. And now we have this theory saying, well, this is the agent in society that, if mobilized into an organization, will be able to achieve that. DSA recognizes this. This is actually, there's about to be a new one of these workers deserve more programs coming out, I think at the end of July. This is the old one. It says our goal is to put the workers in charge of the government through a new democratic constitution that establishes civil, political, and democratic rights for all. It's based on political representation, unicameral legislature, and then with that government, a government of, by, and for the working class, going back to Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, I suppose, that will give us the power to organize, build up our movement, so on and so forth. The very last thing I'll say as I come to an end is that there is sort of a broad rally against all the worst aspects of how the 4th of July are used. And DSA actually, National DSA did actually endorse it. I'm actually going to go. It's this mobilization against genocide. It's in Atlanta on July 4th. And so I put this here, there's Frederick Douglass, just to say that this is still part of the zeitgeist, if you will. When the 4th of July happens, people do use it as a way to make their point. Now, whether or not it's to make the point so pointedly around the Constitution, as I do, not necessarily. I don't think that that's going to be the dominant discourse at this particular event. But it is a way of saying, look at the hypocrisy, right? That's what Frederick Douglass's statement is so good at doing, right? What the hell to the slave is this 4th of July? I think lots of people who are not physically held in shackles in chattel slavery, a lot of people today in the U.S. can look around and say, these principles of universal and equal rights, and you can remake the government if it doesn't meet those rights. Yeah, still seems like we're less than free in a lot of really important ways.